Picture the heavy, suffocating silence in a room where the end of the world is being casually debated as a viable political strategy. You can almost feel the chill in the air, the kind of absolute bone-deep cold that only exists in the corridors of ultimate power when something irreversibly catastrophic is about to happen. Right now, in the very heart of America, the political machinery is not just breaking down, it is tearing itself apart from the inside out in a spectacle of unparalleled chaos. We are watching a full-blown mutiny against President Donald Trump unfold in real time, a terrifying rebellion that has forced him to pull the emergency brake on his own administration. Half the government is being gutted. Dozens of highly decorated generals are being unceremoniously thrown out into the cold. Honestly, even I can hardly believe this is happening in front of our eyes. We are sitting here, live witnesses to a shadow war that is not just decimating Iran and leaving massive scars across Israel, but is fundamentally fracturing the United States of America. The news is breaking at a dizzying, terrifying pace, updating minute by minute with details that seem ripped from a dystopian political thriller. And I know what you are thinking. You are thinking this sounds like the peak of the crisis, but you need to stay with me as we unravel this, because the most chilling revelation, the darkest truth of all, is hiding at the very bottom of this abyss. Before we even begin to dissect the brutal political executions happening in Washington, we have to look out across the dark, turbulent waters of the Persian Gulf. Out there, the reality of this war is bleeding through the official narrative. There are two immediate military developments that the government is desperately trying to bury. The Revolutionary Guards in southern Iran have just achieved what American officials swore was impossible. They have shot down an American fighter jet. Early reports, whispered through back channels and encrypted military chatter, paint a grim picture. An American F-15 fighter jet plunged from the sky, crashing violently into the churning ocean between the island of Hengam and the island of Keshem. Imagine the sheer terror of that descent, the alarms blaring in the cockpit, the sudden violent impact as millions of dollars of advanced military engineering vanished into the dark, crushing depths of the Persian Gulf. Naturally, the United States government stepped up to the podiums in their brightly lit press rooms, wearing perfectly tailored suits and calm, reassuring smiles, and completely denied the entire event. They looked the public right in the eye and said absolutely nothing happened, everything is perfectly fine, our operations are flawless. But here is where the official story begins to rot from the inside out. If no American plane was shot down, if the skies are as safe and secure as they claim, then why are heavy military recovery drones desperately circling over that exact specific coordinate in the ocean? They are flying in tight, systematic grid patterns, searching the deep waters like mechanical vultures looking for a corpse. It is a haunting image, the silent drones buzzing over the dark water hunting for the wreckage of a lie. And the answer to why they are there is the exact thing the government is terrified of admitting. But the deception does not stop at downed multi-million-dollar aircraft. The lies are far more insidious, and they involve human lives. Since the United States launched this war against Iran a little over a month ago, hundreds of American soldiers have been killed or severely wounded in the region. Yet the official numbers released by the United States Central Command, CENTCOM, are laughably, tragically outdated. They are feeding the public sanitized, aggressively low casualty figures. And honestly, this does not surprise me in the slightest. We have seen this dark playbook before. This is the exact same psychological manipulation tactic they used during the darkest days of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. You keep the official death toll artificially low during the heaviest fighting to prevent mass panic, to keep the soldiers from losing morale, and most importantly, to keep the civilian population from rising up in absolute outrage. They hide the reality of the blood soaking the sand. But history tells us what happens next. The moment the conflict technically cools down, suddenly, quietly, the true numbers are released. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of dead and broken bodies miraculously appear on the ledgers, casualties that were supposedly just forgotten in the fog of war. It is a calculated, cold-blooded delay. Because when a war is failing catastrophically and the public mood is already teetering on the edge of utter despair, the absolute last thing a commander-in-chief wants to admit is that he is currently signing orders to fly hundreds of black body bags back to American soil in the dead of night. And that is exactly the nightmare scenario playing out right now. The Iran war has spiraled completely out of control. It is a chaotic, bloody quagmire where both Israel and America are absorbing massive, unprecedented defeats. In a desperate bid to salvage his legacy and present some kind of twisted victory to the American people, Donald Trump is pushing all his chips to the center of the table, betting everything on a massive, bloody ground offensive. But it is this exact, desperate gamble that has finally shattered the illusion of control. This reckless push for a ground war has become the breaking point, the catalyst for a full-scale uprising within his own ranks. The military brass and the political elite have finally looked into the abyss and decided they will not jump. The mutiny is real, and the consequences are shaking the very foundations of the American government. What happens to a nation when the men and women trusted to protect the truth suddenly realize their only job is to protect a lie? We pause here to recognize a profound truth about the nature of massive institutions and the illusion of control. Throughout human history, whether in ancient empires or modern superpowers, power always seeks to insulate itself from the consequences of its own actions. We are taught to believe that governments operate on a foundation of truth and civic responsibility. But the reality is that truth is often the very first casualty of ambition. When leaders manipulate the reality of death, when they hide the bodies of the fallen to protect their own political survival, they are not just lying to the public, they are fundamentally breaking the social contract. Trust is the invisible glue that holds a civilization together, and when that trust is weaponized, when citizens are treated not as partners in a democracy, but as subjects to be managed and shielded from the harsh light of reality, the entire structure begins to rot. The lesson here is deeply personal for all of us. We must cultivate a fierce, unwavering commitment to seeking the truth, even when the lie is far more comforting. We must understand that true civic responsibility does not mean blind obedience to authority, but rather a constant, vigilant questioning of those who hold our lives in their hands. The facade of control is fragile, and it shatters the moment we refuse to look away from the uncomfortable realities they try to bury. How far will an isolated leader go when the only people left in the room are the ones holding the knives? The answer is playing out in the ruthless, paranoid corridors of the West Wing. Faced with a rebellion he cannot control, Donald Trump has pulled the emergency brake and started a purge of historic proportions. He is decapitating his own government, firing one official after another in a frantic, desperate attempt to regain control. In just the last 24 hours, a wave of terror has swept through Washington. We have learned that Trump has completely gutted the Department of Justice, eliminating 3 different top-tier officials, and has now violently ousted the Director of National Intelligence. This is not normal political turnover. This is a massacre. There are only 2 logical explanations for a purge of this magnitude in the intelligence and justice sectors. Either these high-ranking officials are flatly refusing to execute an order so deeply illegal, so fundamentally abhorrent that it crosses their absolute moral red line, or there is a monumental, earth-shattering intelligence scandal brewing just beneath the surface, and Trump is frantically tossing bodies overboard to save himself. And let me assure you, this Bloody Tuesday is merely the tip of a colossal, terrifying iceberg. Let us walk through this slaughterhouse step by step. First, the most shocking execution of all. The president fired his attorney general, Pam Bondi. This is a staggering development. Pam Bondi was not some casual political appointee. She was fiercely, fiercely loyal to Donald Trump. There are countless reports detailing how she threw herself onto political grenades for him, allegedly even shielding him from the fallout of top-secret document scandals. She was the ultimate loyalist, a true believer who stood by him when others fled. But in the ruthless calculus of this new Washington, past loyalty means absolutely nothing. She was fired with ice-cold precision. The scene is described as brutal, reminiscent of the infamous TV show Catchphrase, except this time it is deadly serious, playing out in the most powerful office in the world. This dramatic explosion follows just a month after the ruthless termination of Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. When a leader turns on his most devoted shields, when he fires the very people who kept him out of prison, it tells you that the situation behind closed doors has degraded into absolute, terrifying paranoia. But the bloodletting was not finished. The firing of Pam Bondi was just the opening act. As the shockwaves reverberated through the Capitol, multiple sources deeply connected to the inner workings of the White House leaked devastating information to the press. They confirmed that intense, hushed conversations are happening right now about the imminent removal of an entire slate of high-ranking officials. We are talking about the complete decapitation of the executive branch. FBI Director Kash Patel, a man who built his entire brand on Trump loyalty, is reportedly on the chopping block. Senior official Daniel Driscoll is targeted. Even Labor Secretary Lori Chavez DeRemer is being lined up for the firing squad. The atmosphere in Washington right now must be thick with terror. Every ring of a phone, every sudden knock on an office door could be the end. I do not know how you process this, but watching this from the outside, you cannot shake the creeping dread that something massive, something incredibly dark and dangerous is lurking just out of sight. This is not just a reshuffle. This is a Stalinist-style purging of anyone who dares to whisper the word no. And yet, the political bloodbath is only half of the nightmare. What happens when the paranoia of a crumbling administration infects the absolute highest ranks of the military machine? This brings us to a deep psychological insight about the corrosive nature of absolute loyalty and the terrifying trajectory of unchecked power. In our daily lives, loyalty is a virtue. We value friends who stand by us, partners who protect us, and colleagues who have our backs. But in the toxic atmosphere of desperate political survival, loyalty becomes a currency that rapidly loses its value. When a leader demands unquestioning obedience, they slowly isolate themselves from reality. They surround themselves with echoes rather than voices. And when the inevitable crisis hits, when the walls start closing in, the paranoid mind does not seek counsel, it seeks scapegoats. The tragedy of the loyalist is the belief that their devotion will somehow protect them from the monster they helped feed. But absolute power has no friends. It views every individual not as a human being, but as a temporary tool to be used and discarded the moment it becomes inconvenient. This teaches us a vital lesson about boundaries and self-respect. If you tie your entire identity and moral compass to the defense of a fundamentally flawed authority, you will eventually find yourself standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing too late that the hand you thought would save you is the very hand pushing you over. We must anchor our loyalty not to individuals, but to principles, to ethics, and to our own unshakable sense of right and wrong. Because when the king goes mad, the most loyal subjects are always the first to bleed. What terrifying order could possibly force men forged in 40 years of brutal war to suddenly look the commander-in-chief in the eye and say, absolutely not? The answer lies in the unprecedented military fracture happening simultaneously. The political purge is terrifying, but the military purge is apocalyptic. The New York Times just dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has unceremoniously fired the highest-ranking general in the United States Army. Let that sink in. The absolute top of the military food chain has been severed. Official statements claim this reflects ongoing dissatisfaction with the Army, but let us strip away the bureaucratic language and look at the screaming contradictions. Donald Trump has stood before the cameras on 2 separate occasions recently and boldly declared that Iran has been defeated, that the military has completely crushed the enemy, and that the United States is operating miles ahead of its own strategic schedule. He is painting a picture of a glorious, effortless victory. So I have a very simple, logical question. If this war is going so magnificently well, if the enemy is vanquished and the plan is a resounding success, why in the world do you suddenly fire the highest-ranking general in the entire army? You do not fire the winning coach in the middle of a championship game. This general was not a desk jockey. He was a seasoned warrior who served the United States for over 40 years. He fought in 5 different brutal combat zones. He possessed the absolute rarest commodity in the military establishment. He was deeply, implicitly trusted by the men and women who served under his command, and he was thrown out like yesterday's garbage. The official narrative is completely falling apart. It does not make any sense. But the carnage in the Pentagon continues. Right alongside him, the Department of Defense terminated General David Hodney, the director of the Vital Transformation and Training Command, and shockingly, Major General William Green, Jr., the chief of the Military Chaplains Corps. What on earth is happening in the war rooms? Why are top-tier generals and the moral leaders of the military suddenly being led to the guillotine? The only conclusion that fits these terrifying facts is that a massive, coordinated rebellion is occurring within the Pentagon. It is highly probable that more and more experienced, battle-hardened commanders are looking at Trump's catastrophic plans for a massive ground offensive and flatly refusing to execute them. They know the terrain. They know the enemy. They know that sending thousands of American kids into that meat grinder will result in nothing but an absolute massacre. They are looking at the madness radiating from the Oval Office, driven by intense external pressures from allies like Israel, and they are choosing their conscience over their careers. They are choosing to mutiny rather than lead their soldiers into a senseless slaughter. And Trump, sensing this massive loss of control, is simply shaving off the top layer of military leadership, trying to find someone, anyone, who will blindly follow his orders. This is a profound crisis of conscience. Just 2 weeks ago, the Deputy Director of Intelligence, Joe Kent, voluntarily resigned his incredibly powerful position. His reasoning was chillingly clear. He stated he could no longer support the Iran war with a clear conscience, explicitly warning that Donald Trump was preparing to feed thousands of Americans into the wood chipper of a ground offensive just to appease foreign pressure. The military elite are desperately trying to hit the brakes, and the chaos is not just contained to the generals. The president is publicly humiliating his closest allies. In a bizarre, rambling statement, Trump declared that if the Iran peace deal falls apart, he will place the entire blame squarely on the shoulders of his own vice president, J.D. Vance. But if the deal somehow succeeds, Trump said he will take 100% of the glory for himself. That is not just a toxic workplace. That is the sound of a leader preparing the sacrificial altar for his own running mate, especially considering J.D. Vance was one of the loudest voices warning against this disastrous war from the very beginning. Trump is also publicly turning on his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. He openly mused to the press, complaining about getting 97% negative coverage, and wondered aloud if Caroline was just doing a miserable, terrible job. He literally asked the public, "Should we keep her?" Imagine being Caroline Leavitt or J.D. Vance, watching the president casually joke about your professional execution on national television. The White House is quite literally burning from the inside. High-ranking heads are rolling across the marble floors, and the president is treating it like a twisted reality television show. But all of this, the firings, the public humiliations, the downed jets, it is all just noise, hiding the true, horrifying reality of why these generals really mutinied. If the generals who said no are gone, who is left to stop the hand hovering over the button? This moment demands a profound reflection on the concept of moral courage and the ultimate limits of institutional obedience. We are raised to believe that following orders, respecting the chain of command, and performing our assigned duties are the hallmarks of a good citizen and a reliable professional. But there comes a critical juncture in the life of every nation, and often in our own personal lives, where the rules of the system collide violently with the fundamental laws of human decency. The generals who stood in that room, men who spent 40 years learning to say yes, sir, finally encountered an order so terrifying that their humanity overrode their training. True moral courage is not found in the easy moments of agreement. It is forged in the terrifying, isolating moment when you realize that saying no will cost you everything you have built. It is the realization that your ultimate responsibility is not to a person, not to a politician, and not even to your career, but to the preservation of life and the integrity of your own soul. The system will always demand compliance, and it will violently punish those who break formation. But history does not remember the men who blindly push the buttons of destruction. It remembers those who had the strength to rip the wires out. In our own lives, we must be vigilant against the slow creep of compromise. We must know exactly where our absolute moral line is drawn in the sand, long before we are ever asked to cross it. Because when the moment of ultimate testing arrives, there is no time to debate. There is only the choice between becoming an instrument of devastation or sacrificing yourself to stop it. What exactly was the order that made the most hardened warriors in America choose professional suicide over compliance? Now we reach the absolute darkest point of this entire crisis. I need you to brace yourself because late last night, deeply connected military analysts leaked the real, underlying reason for this massive military mutiny. If this information is accurate, and the sheer scale of the panic in Washington suggests it is, then the world has been teetering on the absolute edge of the abyss. The rumors sweeping through the highest levels of the defense establishment reveal that the termination of these 4 commanding generals had absolutely nothing to do with a standard ground troop offensive. The decisions regarding ground troops were allegedly settled weeks ago. The terrifying, stomach-churning reality that makes absolute perfect sense of this entire chaotic purge is something far worse. The generals were fired because they categorically refused to execute a direct, catastrophic order to obliterate the electrical and civilian infrastructure of Tehran, combined with an unannounced apocalyptic plan to drop the Moab directly onto the city. The Moab, the mother of all bombs, the massive ordnance air blast. For those who do not understand the sheer terror of this weapon, it is the single most powerful non-nuclear weapon in the entire global arsenal. It is a thermobaric nightmare. When a Moab detonates, it does not just explode. It creates a massive, sustained shockwave of immense pressure and burning heat that literally sucks the oxygen out of the surrounding atmosphere. It collapses lungs. It liquefies internal organs. It vaporizes everything within its massive blast radius. The destructive footprint is measured in hundreds and hundreds of meters of absolute, inescapable annihilation. The explicit stated goal of dropping this monstrous weapon on Tehran was not a tactical military strike against a base. The leaked plan was designed specifically to create a modern-day Hiroshima and Nagasaki effect. It was intended as a weapon of sheer psychological terror, designed to break the will of the nation by inflicting unfathomable civilian casualties. They were planning to drop this apocalyptic weapon right into the heart of a densely populated capital city. Tehran is not a military outpost. It is a sprawling, vibrant metropolis filled with over 10 million human beings. 10 million innocent men, women, and children. You are talking about wiping out entire city blocks, instantly incinerating thousands upon thousands of people in a single blinding flash of hellfire, just to send a political message, just to secure a victory in a war that never should have started. When you understand the sheer demonic scale of that order, suddenly everything makes perfect, terrifying sense. When a group of generals, men who have seen the gruesome reality of war up close, are commanded to essentially commit a massive, historic war crime against 10 million civilians, their refusal is not just understandable, it is a testament to the last remaining shreds of humanity inside the war machine. They looked at an order to burn a city alive, an order that would stain the soul of America for 1,000 years, and they said no. And for that act of supreme moral courage, they were systematically hunted down and fired by a desperate president looking for someone devoid of conscience to pull the trigger. This brings us to our final, deepest truth about the psychology of total destruction and the terrifying human capacity for rationalizing the unimaginable. When leaders become trapped in the corner of their own making, when the facade of their power begins to crumble, the temptation to use overwhelming, catastrophic violence becomes a seductive illusion of control. We see this not just in geopolitical warfare, but in the microdynamics of human conflict. When people feel they are losing, there is a dark, primal urge to flip the board, to cause so much devastation that the original failure is forgotten in the smoke. The terrifying reality of the Moab order is that someone, somewhere in a sterile, air-conditioned room, looked at a map of 10 million breathing souls and reduced them to a psychological pressure point. They abstracted human life to such a degree that mass incineration seemed like a viable diplomatic tool. This is the ultimate danger of viewing the world purely through the lens of power and victory. When winning becomes the only metric of success, humanity becomes an expendable resource. The ultimate lesson we must take from this horrifying glimpse into the abyss is that peace and civilization are incredibly fragile constructs, held together only by the constant active choice to recognize the humanity in others. We must fiercely resist the creeping normalization of extreme rhetoric and the sanitization of violence. The moment we allow our leaders, or even ourselves, to view other human beings simply as obstacles to be removed or statistics to be managed, we open the door to the darkest angels of our nature. As we watch this political earthquake shake the foundations of power, as we see the loyalists purged, the generals cast out, and the terrifying truth of these apocalyptic orders brought to the light, we are left standing on the edge of a profoundly altered world. This is not just a story about a failing administration or a disastrous war in the Middle East. It is a stark, undeniable mirror held up to the very core of human nature. It shows us the terrifying depths to which desperate power will sink, but it also shows us the incredible, resilient power of the human conscience. The fact that men in uniform looked at an order for mass destruction and chose to lose everything rather than execute it is a haunting reminder that even in the darkest corridors of power, the light of moral responsibility can still flicker. We are witnessing a monumental collision between the ruthless machinery of absolute ambition and the unyielding boundaries of the human soul. What happens next will not just determine the fate of a presidency or the outcome of a war, it will define the moral trajectory of our entire generation. The silence following the storm is heavy, and it demands our unwavering attention.